Thank you for that introduction, Dr. Daigle. And my talk today, if I can get my, okay, there we go, is called I Am in Full Control, Reassessing Anwar al-Sadat's Role in the Camp David Peace Process. So, in November 1979, American President Jimmy Carter wrote to President Anwar al-Sadat of Egypt and Crown Prince Fahd of Saudi Arabia, quote, "One of my most serious problems as president is the lack of understanding and harmony between you. This situation is very damaging to me politically and also creates a major obstacle in the achievement of a comprehensive peace in the Middle East. We should be acting in concert, but instead we are divided." Carter explicitly acknowledged the difficulties Sadat's rhetoric created for efforts to transform a bilateral Egyptian-Israeli peace into a comprehensive Arab-Israeli peace. Indeed, Sadat presented numerous challenges for the Carter administration's Middle East policy. These go largely unnoticed in the scholarship on the Camp David peace process. This paper seeks to nuance historians' overwhelmingly positive depiction of Sadat's role in the struggle for peace in the Middle East. It also attempts to explain why these historians have shied away from discussing his negative contributions to that process. The historical record shows that Sadat presented significant challenges to Carter's Middle East policy in ways directly connected to the peace process. First, he helped ensure that the peace process remained bilateral rather than expanding into a comprehensive Arab-Israeli agreement. Second, while American documents reveal Sadat's frustration and even occasional panic over his isolation, they also show that Sadat often vacillated in this regard. He could disparage the Arabs at one moment and the next complain to the Americans about his isolation from the Arab world, even though he consistently worsened that isolation through his brazen clashes with other Arabs in direct defiance of American requests that he toned down such criticisms. But he also fluctuated in his support for a comprehensive peace, regularly giving lip service to the idea of including the Palestinians and other Arabs, but frequently using caustic rhetoric which drove them away. His indecisiveness made it difficult for the Carter administration not only to attract other Arab states into the peace process, but also to create a consultative security framework to protect against regional instability and Soviet encroachment. So we'll just jump in right here to the narrative part of this paper. So when Sadat went to Jerusalem in November 1977 to invite the Israelis to struggle for peace, the peace process turned in a bilateral direction. The Carter administration had been trying to get a comprehensive peace conference together, but that plan had recently foundered. And so Sadat's Jerusalem initiative made it difficult for American officials to dispel the perception that Egypt was pursuing a separate peace, which is something that the United States did not want. In his diary, Carter wrote, quote, "Our fears concerning their, that is Egypt's and Israel's, inclinations to deal bilaterally might be confirmed." And the Soviets certainly interpreted Sadat's move as indicating a move towards a bilateral sort of negotiation. And they saw it as an American ploy to exclude them from the process. Sadat was also dismissive of the Arab rejectionists, that is, those Arab states who refused to even negotiate with Israel. But he also didn't really care about bringing the so-called moderate Arab states in, because he assumed that they would have to follow his lead because Egypt was, at the time, the most powerful Arab state. Ultimately, the Soviets and the other Arabs did not join the peace process, partly because Sadat wanted to exclude them, because he believed they would weaken the Egyptian position. Sadat visited the United States to consult with President Jimmy Carter in early February of 1978. Sadat reiterated his disdain for the rejectionists, stating that they couldn't possibly disrupt the peace process because he supposedly had the support of something like 90% of the Arab world, which he did not actually have that support. Sadat framed his main concern not with the rejectionists, but with Israeli intractability on the Palestinian problem and withdrawal from the occupied territories, which he saw as vital to get the moderate Arabs to come into the peace process, which is interesting because he would flip between saying, oh, they'll just join on their own, and oh, we have to bring them in. During his meeting with Carter, Sadat said something to the effect of that the rejection camp can't hurt, Begin can, and you can see President Carter's notes, his handwritten notes there on the screen. But Sadat clearly feared the rejectionists. He was still gravely concerned about Libyan and Soviet meddling in the Horn of Africa. He was insisting on new weapons agreements with the United States and wringing his hands about his supposed encirclement by the Soviets and their friends, as Dr. Daigle has written. Sadat also flouted the other Arabs, almost daring them to act against him. So, for example, in mid-1978, he didn't really care that Egypt was on the verge of being expelled from the Organization of African Union or the Non-Aligned Movement. But when the peace talks with Israel stalled, Sadat became so frustrated with Prime Minister Menachem Begin that he actually publicly threatened war. And according to Carter's diary, that threat helps push him to invite Sadat and Begin to come to Camp David. So when they met at Camp David in September of 1978, Sadat thought that he could negotiate on behalf of the other Arabs, particularly Jordan and the Palestinians, which of course did not end up being the case. Because Sadat was more willing than Begin to make concessions, the Camp David process ultimately achieved little more than a bilateral Egyptian-Israeli peace, significant though that is, and symbolic but immaterial negotiations on Palestinian autonomy that ultimately went nowhere. Sadat sharpened his rhetoric against other Arabs after the Camp David Accords, mocking other Arabs as, quote, dwarfs and pygmies. Some within the Egyptian government actually thought he was intentionally inflaming relations with other Arabs so as to keep them out of the negotiations. And it worked. Because in November of 1978, the Arab League met in Baghdad, Iraq, and they agreed on potential punitive measures to be brought against Egypt, to be implemented against Egypt if it were to sign a separate peace with Israel. And Sadat reacted in a very contradictory way to this, basically saying, oh, it doesn't matter what they do, it's fine, I'm still in control here. But he also lashed out publicly and also briefly intensified his negotiating position. Even after the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty was signed in late March 1979, and Egypt was suspended by the Arab League for that decision, American policymakers feared that further rejectionist pressure on Egypt was going to threaten the prospects for a comprehensive peace, which would increase the chances of war and therefore of renewed Soviet involvement in the Middle East. So they tried to gain Saudi and Jordanian support for the peace process, while also trying to lure them into a consultative security framework to counter the regional threats that they were seeing. But ultimately, this did not work. And Sadat played no small role in this lack of progress. He not only convinced American officials that the other Arabs would simply follow the Egyptian lead, but he also sided with Begin to oppose American attempts to negotiate with the Palestinians, meaning that the Palestinians were not going to have their particular set of problems solved, meaning the other Arabs were not going to join the negotiations or the consultative security framework. And Sadat continued to emphasize the radical and Soviet threats that he perceived, while also not really caring that he was about to be kicked out of several international organizations. And the United States actually had to work with moderate Arabs to prevent that from happening. And this ended up ultimately hurting American relations with the Saudis and the Jordanians, because they had to keep coming back to them and pressing them on these things. And eventually, American officials started noticing that Sadat was actually really causing them quite a bit of grief. And so, responding to some of these developments in a memorandum to National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski, National Security Council member William Quandt noted, quote, Sadat brought some of this on himself in reference to the Saudis withdrawing some funding from Egypt. And only 2 days later, during a high-level meeting on Middle East regional security, Secretary of State Cyrus Vance ventured that, quote, we also need to talk about how to stop Sadat from sounding off against the other Arabs. And this just kept on happening over the course of the stretch of time from 1977 through 1981, where Sadat kept on saying things publicly and privately that inflamed tensions with the other Arab states. And then the United States had to step in and try to mediate that struggle. And obviously, you'll hear more about that from the US-Saudi perspective from Dr. Forsberg in a minute. And Sadat kept doing this despite his anxieties over isolation. And so he really appeared to be vacillating. American officials started noticing this. And the United States ultimately ended up continuing to try to work with moderates to steer things away from going poorly for Egypt. So, for example, keeping the Organization of African Union from kicking Egypt out, things of that nature. But really, this ended up hurting American interests in the Middle East in the long run. And of course, Sadat was eventually assassinated in October of 1981. But as this brief chronology demonstrates, Anwar Sadat played an important role in preventing a comprehensive peace in the Middle East, thereby negatively impacting American policy in the region. So now, what I want to know is why then are most studies of the Camp David peace process so positive in their descriptions of Sadat? The main reason seems to be that a lot of the memoirs and firsthand accounts from the Carter administration portrayed Sadat positively, which in turn shaped the secondary literature. So if we assume that's right, then why were American officials' accounts of Sadat so glowing if they were irritated with him, to say the least, during the negotiations? There are a couple different reasons, and I think they're interconnected, and they apply both to the primary sources, I should say the memoirs of the Carter administration, but also to some of the secondary literature that they influenced. First, Sadat was the prime mover in the negotiations. His bravery and emotion, and in going to Jerusalem, bought him a ton of emotional cachet and goodwill with the Americans. Secondly, and relatedly, because Begin was so intransigent and Sadat was so conciliatory, often to a fault, the Egyptian president seemed far better by comparison. Third, as is often noted, Sadat was far more amicable than Begin was and enjoyed a much better relationship with Carter and other American officials than his Israeli counterpart did. Fourth, the Carter administration officials seem to have recognized that much of Sadat's calculus stemmed from his desire to pivot away from the Soviet Union towards the United States for military and economic aid. But that's not really present in the documentary record, but it is present in the memoirs. So it seems that these American officials recognized this after the fact. Fifth, Sadat's obstructive actions tended to take place outside of the immediate context of the Egyptian-Israeli negotiations. And finally, when Sadat was assassinated in 1981, that was generally perceived as him paying the price for peace, which made him something of a martyr, and therefore, presumably, some folks were a little bit less likely to criticize him for his role in the Camp David peace process. So that's going to conclude my remarks right now, but I'm looking forward to everyone's questions. Thank you.